שקלים, Mishnah Aleph. The Mishnah lists 15 different tasks that were overseen by different administrators in the Beis Hamikdash, as well as the names of these people. Now, obviously, these people didn't live forever, but the Rav says, they weren't all at one time. It mentions all the guttas, all the chsidim and the ksherim, and these officials had other people who worked under them, and the Rav says, the Rabbi said, Pirshu Marabeim taught Al Shem Sham Amunim Arishenim, the original administrators, Shenis Manuel Kach, that were appointed for these jobs, Kach HaYashmam, Lefikach Nikra B'Machrem Al Shmam. So the guy afterwards, he was called by the same name as the original one. Elohin HaMemunim, these are the administrators, the appointed ones who were in charge of various tasks and jobs and roles in the Beis HaMikdash. Yochanan ben Pinchas HaLachisamais, Yochanan ben Pinchas was responsible for providing the tokens that people would use to obtain the Nesachim. Achia ala Nesachim, Achia was responsible for providing people who presented the tokens with the corresponding Nesachim offerings. Nesachim consisted of wine, which was poured on the Mizbeach, as well as a mincha of flour mixed with oil, which is burnt on the Mizbeach. The process of trading in tokens for the Nesachim offerings will be described in Mishnah Gimel and Dalet. Matisyo ben Shmuel ala Payisos. Matisya ben Shmuel was responsible for the lotteries that determined which of the Kohanim would perform the various parts of the Avodah. These lotteries decided which Kohen did which Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash that day, and Matisya ben Shmuel was in charge of these lotteries. Psachi ala Kinim, Psachi was responsible for the chest in which people who needed to bring pairs of birds as karbonos would place their money. Every day he would note how much money had been placed in the chest, and then make sure that the corresponding number of birds were offered before the day was over. Who brings birds? So we know that a Zov or a Zova or a Yeledas, as we mentioned in the Perek Aleph Mishnah Hey, must each bring a pair of birds as a carbon. However, they didn't have to provide these birds themselves. Instead, they would bring enough money to pay for the birds and place the money in a special chest for these karbonos. This official had to be an exceptional Talmud Chochem in order to resolve the many uncertainties that would arise in connection with these birds. As anybody who knows Masechta Kinim knows, or anybody who has learned Masechta Kinim, even if they don't know it, as they like to Rav, and in order for this position, the person had to be an extraordinary Talmud Chacham and a Baki, Kedaminim Sechta Ovis, like the Mishnah says in Ovis, Kirum Epischeni, the Hein Hein Gufi Halachas, the Cheshbainis of properly taking care of a Kinim, of these bird karbonis when they get mixed up, and the Pischenida, and taking care of the different Einis and Vestis, it's very complicated. It's a Hein Hein Gufi Halachas. These are very basic Gufi Halachas and how Talmud Chacham has to learn how to think. Psachi is a Mordechai. Psachi is actually Mordechai who helped save the Yidden during the times of Purim. Mordechai moved to Eretz Yisrael and was appointed to this role in the second Beis HaMikdash soon after it was rebuilt. And why then was his name Psachi, which comes from the Hebrew word Pesach, which means to open, because he would open the words people spoke and explain them, that is, he could understand what people meant to say, even if they didn't say it clearly, and he also knew all 70 languages. The languages spoken by the original 70 nations, who are listed in Parashas Vayach, all other languages spoken in the world are based on these 70 languages. And we know that the concept is that they really have there's Shivim, Sarim, there's 70 Malachim and Shemayim. Each one represents a different Ummah, a different nation. Klal Yisrael doesn't have a Sar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Sar, Kaviyachal of Klal Yisrael. That's why the Gemara Ksubis says that Misha Dar B'chutzar, it says Kamisha Ein Le'eleka, and somebody who lives in Eretz Yisrael does have an Eleka because he's under the direct leadership, jurisdiction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu without going through any Sar. Psachi's skill with languages was helpful in his role in the Beis HaMikdash because people had come from all over the world to bring karbonos. When they would explain what type of karbonos they were bringing, Psachi could understand them, even if they didn't explain themselves clearly. As we know, Mordechai was on, as we know from the Purim tape, Mordechai was on the Sanhedrin, so he was able to understand what Big Son and Seresh were saying, even though they were talking in a foreign language. The pasuk refers to Mordechai as Bilshan, Sha'olam min Agoyla, Bilshan that went up from the Goyla of an Ikerken Shea Boila L'Shein Leitharbe, he was able to mix and talk in many different languages, and it's it's a very great zach for a person to be able to speak many languages. I want to say over here that the Pesach B'Dvarim was that he was able to be Pesach a new sefer to add to the Chav Dal Sefer Tanakh. Because Tilman Gil says that there's only Chav Gimel Sefer Tanakh, and there's a whole shayla in the Gemara because they said Kasvuni L'Dairis, so you're allowed to write it, you're not allowed to write it. And the concept is because the Gemara, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says that one of the people that Eilam Chelik Leil Mabo is Hafakar B'Svar Machitzainim, somebody who reads the outside books. Now it doesn't mean Chacham Machitzainis because it's not what it says. And the pashtus is that there were many tzaddikim and chachamim that learned Chacham Machitzainis. So what's Hafakar B'Svar Machitzainim? One of the understandings is that you equate the Sifrei Tanakh, you equate outside the books that are outside the Sifrei Tanakh with the Sifrei Tanakh. You give them the same chashivas, you treat it with the same kavod and the same kedusha, so that's a big problem. So in order for Megillas Esther to take on the kedusha of the Shtar Sifrei HaTanakh, it had to name on a very high madrega. So that's what Mordechai Psachi was darshaning, Pesach B'Dvarim V'Dorsha, that he should be able to get his sefer of Kasvuni L'Dairis into the Sifrei HaTanakh. Ben Achia al-Chayli Meyayim. Ben Achia was responsible for treating Kehanim who suffered from intestinal problems. The Kehanim who served in the Beis HaMikdash often developed intestinal illnesses because they ate large amounts of meat from the karbanos and couldn't drink wine, which helps with digestion, since it's also for Kehanim to drink wine at the Beis HaMikdash. In addition, the Kehanim also had to walk barefoot on the cold stone Beis HaMikdash floor, which made them weak. Therefore, there was a need for a regular doctor in the Beis HaMikdash to recommend appropriate medications to the Kehanim who required treatment. Okay. And Nechunya Chayfer Shichin. Nechunya he would dig ditches. He was responsible for digging Shichin, where they would collect water in it, so people who travel to the Beis HaMikdash for Shalosh Regalim should have water. And we know about him from the Gemara in Baba Kama and Daf Nun, that his daughter fell into a well, and they went to Rav Chanina and Daisa to be mispalel, and he was mispalel, and he said that everything's okay. And Ba'oisa Shah, that was when she said she saw a man, walking with the ram, which was the schus of Avram Avinu, because he was Chayfer Shichin. He dug wells for people that came up to Aliyah L'Regel. So, like the Gemara says, the taina was that the Avarsh, this tzaddik did a tremendous ishtadlus, and so Yikashal B'Zaroi, his children should be nichshal in the same thing that he was so much mesari to do. So that's why he was able to get out. That's interesting. Why are we saying this dafka? But Avram Avinu, that Avram Avinu was the one that was matzil him. The Gemara says, "Mayovu pa'amayach bana olam bas nadav bite shel Avram Avinu," that the concept of Aliyah L'Regel, the Riyas Panim Ba'azara, is shaykh to Avram Avinu, and the Gemara refers to Klal Yisrael bas nadav as Klal Yisrael as being bitay shel Avram Avinu, which is we're going to see our father in the Shalosh Regalim. Givini Karois. Givini was the announcer. When it was time to begin the morning services, would announce, "Arise, Kehanim, to your avodah." Ben Gever al Ne'ilas She'orim. Ben Gever was responsible for locking the Beis HaMikdash Azara, the Shari or Azara, in the evening, for unlocking them in the morning. That's interesting that doesn't necessarily mean that he himself had to do it, but it means that he was responsible for it. So he would have, like we mentioned earlier, the Rambam says in Hilchos Klei Mikdash that they would have people working under them. Ben Bevai ala Pokia. Ben Bevai was responsible for the whip. He would walk through the Beis HaMikdash each night to make sure that none of the guards had fallen asleep, and use his whip to wake up anyone who had fallen asleep. And it's just interesting because the Mishnah at the beginning of Tamid and Midas, where it discusses the mishmaros where the Kehanim would watch, it doesn't say there that they would whip him, but we'll see that because the Rav brings it. Lahalkas HaKehanim HaLevim, he'd walk around with the whip to whip the Kehanim and the Levim Shenimtzu Yishenim HaMishmarisayim, they were falling asleep or dozing off on their watches. Sheyushem Es HaMikdash Ba'layla Kedamorim Masech Midas Misha Yemaisa Maisa Yashen HaYuchayv Naisem Sarfin Ksusay. They would find somebody sleeping on the job, they would hit him, and they would burn his clothing, they would light him on fire. Now, obviously, people didn't want that, so he didn't fall asleep. They were careful about it. But I guess they were chayv to say with this pakia. Yerushalmi Mefarish, the Yerushalmi explains that Hapakir is a psilis shel menorah shel beis hasheyeva k'demrin b'perek hachalil. The psilis, the leftover threads from the menorah, from the Simchas Beis Hasheyeva, like the Gemara says in Sukkah Daf Nun Aleph, mibaloi nichse kehanim mehem yenein hayimafkiin psilis. Where would they get the wicks from for the menorah and the lamps that they would light by the Simchas Beis Hasheyeva? They would take them from the worn out big de kahuna from the kehanim, and they would turn them into psilis. Which is interesting, because if they would light the clothing on fire, they would burn the clothing, and then they couldn't wear them anymore. Because the halacha is that it's too chaser, or it's missing, or it's this and it's that after the clothing gets burned. So then they would, I guess they wouldn't just throw them out. It has kedusha, so I guess they would use that for. It could be they were already using singed wicks to light the menorah and to light the lights of the Simchas Beis Hasheyeva, like the Gemara says in Sukkah. How we could put the two things together. Ben Arza ala Tziltzal. Ben Arza was responsible for sounding the cymbals, which indicated to the Levium that they should begin playing the instruments. The Levium would play instruments and sing, while the Yayin, that was part of the Korban Tamid that was brought every day, as well as the other Korban Tzibur, were poured on the Mizbech. And Hugras ben Levi al Ashir, Hugras was a Levi, was responsible for directing the singing of the Levium, indicating to them when the song should begin and end. He would also select the Levium who would participate in the singing and teach them the music. And I guess he would help them with the musical notes, and he would help them play the instruments as well. It's interesting, I'm trying to think what the name of Hugras would mean. It's a lesson of like Hugoras, I guess, because he would help them get familiar and to be goyres, to learn over the negina and the notes and the instruments and how to organize the music. Beis Garmu al-Maisa Lechem Aponim, the family of the house of Garmu, was responsible for the production of the Lechem Aponim. As we know, the Gemara says, the Gemara here and the Gemara Yuma talks about how difficult it was to make it. There were certain tricks how to do it, to take it out of the oven, shalei shaver, and when they're sitting in the oven, when they're sitting on the shulchan, that they shouldn't spoil. And Beis Avtinas al-Maisa K'tairos, the family of the house of Avtinas, was responsible for the production of the K'tairos, which was burned on the Mizbeach HaZahav every morning and every afternoon. It was a compound of several ground spices. The family of Beis Avtinas were experts in the process of grinding and mixing the spices. In addition, a special kind of grass was added to the K'tairos, and the effect of this grass was to make the smoke of the burning K'tairos rise in a straight column instead of spreading in every direction. The identity of this grass was known, but with a certain special Meseira, only to the family of Avtinas. For this reason, they were placed in charge of preparing the K'tairos. Now, the Gemara says that it was Kilu Adhain on them, like the Gemara Yuma says, Zecher Tzadik Levrach, Shem Shem Yirkov. Shem Shem Yirkov is going on these people that didn't want to share the tricks, but the Zach was that they found these people and they asked them, and this family was megal to them only afterwards that the pshat is because they had to give us the tricks that were used specifically for the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, for very strict Avodah Hashem. It's not becoming to be mefarsim and then allow other people. They were chayshish that people would use it for Avodah Zarah, and they didn't want to use these. They didn't want that their talents and their extra special ideas about certain things should be used for Avodah Zarah, so they did not share them with others. So then the Gemara is mishabech them that was the right thing. Elazar la Parayches. Elazar was responsible for the 13 curtains that hung at various entranceways in the Beis HaMikdash and would replace them when they wore out. Maybe also they would take care of them when they would become tamei, to be toivel them, to be metahar them, like the Mishnah speaks elsewhere, that it was a big avodah to be toivel it, however many kehanim they needed to be toivel it. Pinchas halamalbish, and Pinchas was responsible for the clothing of the kehanim, for dressing the kehanim in the big day kahuna. He was also responsible for undressing them when they finished the avodah, and for storing the big day kahuna in the appropriate places within the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the zarch was that he had to be a tailor, because the concept is that, as we said before, the big day kahuna has to fit the kain exactly, and it has to be, they didn't have machines like they have today, but they had to fit. It had to fit the kehanim exactly. So he would measure them, and he would have to take care of that, and make sure that all shimmed well. Just interesting that the last person in the Mishnah is Pinchas ala Malbush. The first person mentioned in the Mishnah is Yechanan ben Pinchas ala Chisamis. I don't know if the two are related. It could be they're not real. As we spoke before, they're not necessarily real names, but it's named after the original one. Maybe these two original people were related. It's hard to know. Mishnah Beis. Ein person Shloisha Gizbarim Mishiva Amar Kolin. We may not have less than 3 treasurers who were in charge of the finances of the Beis HaMikdash. Among other things, they were in charge of spending the funds from the Beis HaMikdash and arranging the evaluation and the pidyon of items that were donated to Hektish. And you cannot have less than Shiva Amar Kalin, less than 7 supervisors who oversee the treasurer. So the Amar Kalin are higher than the Gizbar. The Rav says that a Nasi, Nasiye Halevi Mitargaminon, the Amar Kalya de Memana. The Lashon Amar Kol is Omar Al Kol. An Amar Kol is the Targum of a Nasi, and it means a Nasi, a person who's in charge, who gives direction. Omar Al Kol, he has a say on everything, in everything. Arvi Karim Legodl Amir. The Amir is the king, is the Nasi. And the as Hashem Hamircha Hayayim, that's the lashon of Hashem Hamircha. Hamircha is the lashon of godless, it's the lashon of Malchus, and the lashon is like Milashon Amir, like the lashon Arvi. And what would these 7 Amar Kalim do? Shiva Mafteches Hazar B'Yadam. They had 7 keys to the Hazar in their hands. There were 7 keys in order to open the Hazara. So the supervisors had to make sure that the treasurers didn't remove anything from the treasury without proper cause. 7 keys were needed to get into the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash, and each one of the supervisors had 1 key. When the Gizbarim wished to enter the Azara in order to reach the rooms where the funds were, they were allowed to do so only if all the supervisors gathered with their keys and let them in at the same time. Although the Mishnah doesn't mention them, there were also 2 general overseers who were in charge of the supervisors. In all, the temple treasury, the Beis HaMikdash treasury, was managed by 5 levels of authority. It was the Kohen Gadol and the deputy Kohen Gadol, the Sgan Kohen, 2 general overseers, the 7 supervisors, and the 3 Gizbar. Which is interesting that it's not mentioned in the Mishnah, but it's mentioned in the Tosefta. Which got interesting because aside from all this, there were obviously the Kehanim and the Leviim and the Mishmaros and the Mamodos of all the people that were in the Beis HaMikdash. And there was a Sanhedrin that was in the Beis HaMikdash, and there was also the Bezdin Shel Kohanim that was in charge of taking care of the yichus of the people in the, if someone said he's a Kohen, or maybe Stam took care of Stam yichus shilas as well. We may not make an appointment for somebody to oversee any financial authorities over the public unless you have 2 people. What does that mean? When a position involves the authority to spend money of the Beis HaMikdash, it may not be held by an individual, but it must be shared by at least 2 people. And the halacha is not limited to the Beis HaMikdash. Any position that involves the power to raise money from the tzibur, such as the tzedakah funds, that you can tax a tzibur, it must be shared by at least 2 people. And the reason is because it's they have to. The Rab brings a pasuk for it. They will take the zahav. So anytime you're taking zahav, anytime you're taking money, it has to be with him. It has to be with them. It has to be with 2 people. Except for Ben Achia, who was responsible for the stomach aches of the Kehanim, and Elazar was responsible for the curtains. As we spoke before, because these aren't mamish money. Because despite the fact that their positions require them to raise and spend money for the Beis HaMikdash, a majority of the tzibur accepted that these officials could serve on their own, and Ben Achia spent the money from the Beis HaMikdash to buy medicine for the Kehanim, and Elazar had to buy wool and linen for the curtains. Now, some of the other officials named in the previous Mishnah also controlled money of the Beis HaMikdash. However, each of these officials had another unnamed official who shared the position with him. Only Ben Achia and Elazar were the individuals on their own because the public accepted them. It's just very interesting that they were merut al alcohol. The tzibur liked them and appreciated them, and I guess the people that followed suit, who took their positions after them, had big shoes to, or in the Beis HaMikdash, no shoes to fill, because they were merut al alcohol. If you have a rav that is very charismatic and is very much merut al alcohol, then somebody takes over, and he may be a good person. He may be Talmid Chacham and all that, but if he's not merutz alcohol, doesn't have the charisma, doesn't have the ability to connect to the olam, the way that the previous Rav did, the Olam feels let down, and it's not geschmack to have to deal with it like that. Mishnah Gimel. We mentioned the Mishnah Aleph, the Yechanan was responsible for providing the tickets, and Achir was responsible for providing the Nesachim. The Mishnah now explains what this means. The Nesachim are brought to a company, a carbon oil or a carbon shlomim, and consists of flour mixed with oil, which is burnt on the Mizbeach as a carbon mincha, and wine, which is poured on the Mizbeach. And the required amount of flour, oil, and wine varies according to the kind of animal offered as an oil or a shlamim. A system was developed to allow people to buy the nesachim in the Beis Hamikdash. Because the flour, oil, and wine were offered on the Mizbeach, special safeguards had to be followed to protect them from tumah, even before they were designated as karbonos, and it was difficult for people to maintain these safeguards in their own homes till they got to the Beis Hamikdash. For this reason, these items were made available in the Beis Hamikdash by itself. I guess this is the makar for the people who sell wine in the mikveh. I guess you come to the Beis Hamikdash and could buy wine. First, they would pay the money to Yochanan, who has proof of payment, would give them a token, or give them a receipt, and that would indicate how much flour, oil, and wine they had to pay for. The Mishnah teaches that different receipts, different tokens, different receipts were used for this purpose, representing the various kinds of karbonos. So they would use 4 different types of tokens that were used for these karbonos. It was really a receipt. At first, Yisrael says that there were pieces of parchment that were stamped with Yechanan's personal seal. Al Kapanim was a receipt. Because of Alem Egel Zocher Gedi Chayte. And written on each of them was a word that indicated what was needed with this receipt. Egel, which meant that he required the nesachim that accompany a cattle offering, which is accompanied by 3 isarin of flour mixed with half a hin of oil, as well as a chatzia hin yayin. And isarin is a dry measure that's equal to the volume of 43.2 eggs. A hin is a liquid measure that is equal to the volume of 72 eggs. And in zachar over here is referring to a ram for the nesachim that accompany a ram offering. A ram is a male sheep that's more than a year old. A ram offering is accompanied by 2 isarin of flour mixed with a third of a hin, shlishas a hin of shemen, as well as a shlishas a hin of yayin. Male sheep younger than 1 year old have the same nesachim as goat and female sheep. Gedi, kid for the nesachim that accompany a goat or sheep offering. A goat or sheep offering is accompanied by 1 isaron mixed with a quarter of a hin of oil, as well as a quarter of a hin of wine. Revius a hin la keves yayin. And the chayte for the nesachim that accompany the karbanos of a mitzayra. The mitzayra, whose taras has healed, brings a series of karbanos to complete his tara process. So ordinarily he brings 3 sheep. One is an oil, one is an asham, one is a chatos. Each animal is accompanied by nesachim. Chatz and asham offerings generally do not have nesachim. However, mitzayra is not for an aveira. Mitzayra is part of the tara process. In addition, the mitzayra requires an additional loig of oil, which is applied to his right ear, thumb, and toe. In total, the mitzayra requires nesachim for 3 sheep, for 3 lambs, which is 9 loig, as well as an additional loig of oil. So he has 10 loig. For this reason, he was given a special token that indicated he needs a combination of flour, oil, and wine. The mitzayra is referred to as a sinner because tzarat generally comes as a punishment for one of the 7 averos that the Chazal mentioned in Masechet Erech and Daf Tes Zayin. Okay, Ben Azai says Chamisha Hoyu, there were 5 different tokens. Aram is Kosav Aleyan, and it was written in Aramaic. Aramaic was a commonly spoken language during the Tkufas Bayis Sheni, while many people couldn't read Lashon Kodesh. So labeling the tokens in Aramaic made it possible for people to see if the administrator had mistakenly given them the wrong one. Although the Mishnah lists 5 Hebrew terms, Ben Azai holds that the Aramaic translations of these terms are written on the tokens. Calf, we explained male, we explained kid, we explained poor sinner. A poor sinner was used for the nesachim that accompany the offerings of a poor mitzayra, who brings only 1 lamb and 2 birds. A mitzayra, who cannot afford all 3 lambs, replaces the lambs for the oil and chatas offering with 2 birds. Bird karbanos are not accompanied by nesachim. Therefore, Ben Azai teaches that there was 1 token for a poor mitzayra who requires only the nesachim for a single lamb, which is 3 loig plus an additional loig of oil, and a separate token for a rich mitzayra, who requires the nesachim for 3 lambs plus an additional loig of oil. The hainu, that when we're dealing with a person who cannot afford to bring animals for a carbon, he brings less nesachim. Person brings more carbonas, brings more animals, brings more nesachim. The Chacham, however, say that a Matzaira who's an ani, simply given the token Gedi, which entitled him to the nesachim for a single lamb. He would bring an additional leg of oil from his home. Since the additional leg was not offered on the mizbech, was simply applied to his body, it didn't have to be specially safeguarded from tumah, because it wasn't used for the Beis Hamikdash. It was used for his Tara process to smear it on his ear, on his finger, and on his toe. And then there's Choyte Dal, and then there's Choyte Oshir, rich sinner for the Nesachim that accompany the carbon of a rich Mitzvah who offers 3 sheep. The calf token was used for the Nesachim that accompany cattle, which were the same whether the cattle was large or small, meaning adult or young, male or female. The kid token was used for the Nesachim that accompany sheep and goats, whether the sheep and goats were large or small, male or female, with the exception of rams. Male sheep that are more than a year old, as we explained previously, it's a separate cheshbon. Bilvad. The male token was used only for the nesachim that accompany rams. The sinner token, the chayte token, was used for the nesachim that accompany the 3 animals that are required for rich mitzvahs. And obviously, there was somebody that would have to take a look at your bank statements and your taxes for the past year to decide if you were considered a ani or a usher in order to qualify for, which mitzvah you would qualify, which carbonos you would qualify for. Mishnah Dalet. Someone who needed to obtain nesachim, someone who already had flour, oil, and wine that had probably been safeguarded from tumah could bring them, but someone who didn't would follow the procedure that was described here. I guess they would have some kind of edus that would testify that he brought up betara, or people testify about this person that he is careful about tara, or he was careful about that he was careful about tara. I think that would be the best way to say it, because if you have edus on a ranch, that's the best. The edus on a zach, because then other people could have touched it. It's not good. Give him money as payment and receive a token from him. The person would then go to Achio, who is the appointed administrator responsible for the nesachim, and he would give him the token and receive the proper nesachim from him. And in the evening, Yochanan and Achio would come together, and Achio would take out the tokens that he had been given that day, and he would receive the corresponding amount of money from Yochanan. Achio would then use this money to buy more flour, oil, and wine from the suppliers of the Beis Hamikdash, as we spoke at the end of Parak Dalet. If there's extra money, if the money Yochanan had on hand was more than the value of the tokens that had been given to Achia that day, the extra money would go to the Hektish, would go to Hektish. We assume that someone who had intentionally paid Yochanan more money than necessary, intending that the extra money should be a nidava to the Mikdash. Therefore, the extra money belongs to the Mikdash and is used to buy animals that are offered for Kates HaMizbeach, as we spoke in Parak Dalet. In Pichsu, but if there was less money than there should have been, Yochanan would be required to pay the differences from his own funds. We assume that Yochanan had either lost some of the money or had not received enough money for the tokens. Since he hadn't properly fulfilled his responsibility, he was required to reimburse the Hektish for the loss. Now, it could be that he had a good salary from the Beis Hamikdash, like most of these people did. Umemelo, he would have enough to be able to be memale this chesar of Hektish. Sheyad Hektish al Elyoina, because the treasury of the Beis Hamikdash always has the upper hand. Furthermore, although Yochanan was held responsible when there was a shortfall, he was not awarded the extra money when there was a surplus, even though it was possible that the surplus had come from his personal money that had gotten mixed together with the funds of the Beis Hamikdash. This is because whenever there's a discrepancy, it's judged in favor of the Beis Hamikdash, as the Mishnah says, Sheyad Hektish al Elyoina, Mishnah Hey. Misha Ovad Bimenu Chaysamam Mamtinin Le'ad Erev. If someone lost his token, they would have him wait until the evening when Yochanan and Achia would make their daily accounting. If upon counting their money they found the surplus equal to the value of his lost token, nice and late, they would give him the nesachim that he had bought, since this shows that his claim was valid. For instance, if he lost the token labeled calf, and the surplus is equal to the amount that he would have had to have paid for the nesachim of a calf, it's proof that he's telling the truth. But if they didn't find the surplus in the amount, they would not have any nesachim given to him because he could not prove that he had paid for them. B'Shem Hayom Kosav Leim Ebnei HaRamoim. And the name of the day, meaning the date, was written on the tokens, the day of the week and the day of the month, and the month that were written on the tokens. For instance, the first day of the week, the first day of Nisan, one would not be able to use the token at a later date unless the day and the date coincided, again, an uncommon occurrence, meaning that this was a real receipt with a date on it as well. And because the swindlers who would otherwise have used the tokens improperly at a later date, the dishonest person might have paid for an asachim when prices were low and then saved his token until the prices rose. He would then have brought the token to Achia and received an asachim, which, because prices had risen, the Beis HaMikdash would have purchased for more money than this person had paid originally. In this way, swindlers would cause the Beis HaMikdash to lose money, so we had to make sure that this didn't happen. So that's why it had a date on it to know what was going on. Okay, Mishnah Vav. There were two chambers in the Beis HaMikdash for special donations. Achas Lishkas Chashoim, one was the chamber of the discreet, chamber of the secret ones for contributions given quietly and taken secretly. Interesting, because you would think, Matam Beseisa is a great Madrig in Staka. Apparently there was an avoida of Matam Beseisa in the Beis HaMikdash as well. Achas Lishkas HaKelim, the other one was the Lishka of utensils. Lishkas Chashoim, the chamber of the secret ones, was used for the following purpose. Sin-fearing people would discreetly place donations in it, and poor people from prominent families and were embarrassed to collect tzedakah would be discreetly supported from the donations placed within it, allowing them to receive tzedakah without any public humiliation. The poor would take what they needed from the lishka without having to interact with those who donated the money. This fulfills the highest form of tzedakah, which is to give in such a manner that the poor do not know who help them, and those who give do not know who receive them. Lishkas HaKelim, the chamber of the utensils, was used for the following purpose. Anyone who wished to donate a utensil to the Beis HaMikdash would throw it into the chamber. Once every 30 days, the treasurers would open the lishka and examine the utensils that had been donated. Any utensil that they found useful for the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash, such as an axe or a hammer that they could use for construction of the Beis HaMikdash or the regular maintenance, they would leave it as it was and use it in the Beis HaMikdash. And the other utensils which were not useful in the Beis HaMikdash would be sold for their value, and the proceeds would go to the Bedek HaBayis for the funds for the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash was kept.